Hi there. You know I've done a couple stories about the mill fires up in Waits River, and I briefly mentioned the one about Bowen Hunter in East Corinth. Well, as a matter of fact, I worked at Bowen Hunter in the summer and fall of 1967. My dad was Raymond Tillotson. He was the foreman of the roughing room, which is roughing, where they bring in the material and make rough bobbins and send them upstairs to the finishing area. So when I first got there, Dad hired me as some kind of a flunky because he knew I wasn't much good for anything. So he put me out in the yard, and my first job was taking blocks away from the bolting saws. In other words, they cut bolts off the end of the logs. But before that, let me just explain a little bit about the yard. They had this huge boom or mast that stuck up in the air with cables holding it up, with a big boom that came off it that could swing 360 degrees. And off of that they had a chain, and you could pick that boom up and do whatever you wanted with it. It was all run by electricity, but the reason for that was they'd dump the logs in there, and they'd move them with the boom. They'd move them around over onto the bolting saw rack, or they could put them into the vat, which was a huge, probably, I want to say 20 by 30 cement structure that was filled with water and heated with steam from the boiler. So it got hot, but the reason they did that was for the wintertime when logs came in all covered with mud and ice, and they were frozen, which was not a good idea to try to saw frozen logs. So they'd put them in that vat for at least overnight. They'd load it up overnight and let them set in there, and they'd get thawed out by morning. And then they'd fish them out and put them up onto the skids that went down into the mill, down into the bolting saw. Well, every year you had to clean that thing out. So that year I got to do it. And you go down in there with a shovel and clean it out. And it'd be that, I don't know, 3 feet of muck and bark and everything down the bottom there, and stink. That was my job. I got to clean that out that summer. But my job was to take away from the bolting saw. Now, the bolting saw was a big saw carriage that reminded me of like a regular board saw carriage, except a board saw carriage goes back and forth the whole length of the log, whereas the bolting saw carriage, you put the log on this carriage, and it had a chain on it, and you just run that chain forward, usually about 16, 18 inches. The log would roll ahead and butt up against this abutment there that would stop it, like a beam or something. And I was just inside of that, down in a hole, so that my chest came up about even with this platform. So when you sawed that, he'd run that across, and it would be right here, right in front of me. He'd run it across, and that platform would run underneath the log. So the big saw was right here. I mean, right there, this 50, 60-inch saw whirling away right there. And the saw didn't move, but the carriage moved in and out. So the log being on there, you'd run it up this way and bang it against the wall, and there'd be that much there. And then he'd run the carriage in, and it would saw that block off. And it would land like that. And there was just enough of a platform between me and the saw, so I could roll that block over, roll it over into a conveyor, and it would go upstairs. Which was hard work, because some of them logs, these are rock maple, and they're green and wet and heavier than the son of a gun. I mean, some of them would be 2 feet through or more. And those things were heavy. And you had to be careful you didn't lose it. So the only bad thing I ever had, a couple bad things happened to me. after they quit using that big mast with the boom on it, because they bought what was called a pettibone, which was an early lull. And they worked around the yard with that, and they could lug logs around and everything, and it was a lot faster, and they needed it everywhere. They used it everywhere. So Claude Cummins was the guy that was running the saw, and most of the time, I'll have to think of his name, but I'll come back to it, worked in taking blocks away. Or off and on, he'd work in the yard. Pearlie Witcher was the one that worked in there. He lived up on the Bear Notch Road, and Clyde Cummins lived in Orford. They were both, Clyde was an awful funny guy, great guy. They were both great guys. But anyway, one time I was out in the yard helping Claude bring some logs in to dump onto there was some bunks that ran onto the carriage of the bolting saw. Well, one of the bad things about that pettibone was that it had forks, and those logs could be slippery. So I was working with him there, and I was walking down towards the bolting saw carriage and that part down in there. And I turned my back on that pettibone, and for just a second, never do it, but I did. And Claude Cummins was in that pettibone running it. And he just beat the horn like that, beep, like that. And I knew that I was in trouble, and I ran just as fast as I could out of there and dove down into where that bolting saw was, where I was safe, where it couldn't get to me. And those logs come crashing up onto that goddamn, onto that carriage. He beat that just in the nick of time. And we talked about it a few minutes later, and he says, man, he says, I'm awful sorry. He says, man, you were just like a cat. He said, you went out of there. He says, it worked good. I said, yeah, thanks for warning me. That was kind of, you had to be careful, because, logs would kill you. So one other time, I was working, taken away from the bolting saw, and Claude rolled a smaller log, about that big, onto the bolting saw carriage, and you could turn it. He had a rig that would turn the log, but he went to line. You had to get it laid on there just right so it would saw. Anyway, he got it on there. I was down in that hole waiting, and he ran it up there and clunked it against this headboard here, and it was all set up. And he went to run the saw through it, and that log was just small enough, and it was icy or something, because we weren't running a vat right then. But that saw started spinning that log on that carriage, spun that 20-foot log, and it was right here, going flop a bang, a bang, a bang, a bang. So I bailed down into the bottom of that hole. So I didn't need to tackle that at all, because I figured it was going to come right into the saw, and hell was going to pay there any minute. But he stopped it and got it backed off so that he got a hold of it, and then we clamped the thing down better so it didn't spin, and we just sawed it up and did like we usually did. But just another thing where things happen fast, and OSHA would have a fit if they came in there today and saw that outfit. But anyway, so that's the way the bolts got, they call them bolts. They were that long because they turned out bobbins. They cut the slabs 4-inch, no, not down there. They'd cut them, so this is long. This is 16 inches long, 15 inches. They'd make the blocks probably maybe 16 to 18 inches. And they'd go across that ramp into this conveyor, go upstairs, and flop down onto the ground. And somebody up there had to pile them up so that they could go onto the Ricker saw. Frank Smith was running the Ricker saw. Now the Ricker saw was another great big, probably 4-foot saw, but it was all kind of enclosed. So what they did is they'd take these blocks, they were 16, 18 inches high. Most of them were like that big. You know, some of them were a little smaller, but most of them were 12, 16 inches through. And you'd stand them on end on that ricker saw. And the table it had a sliding table. The saw stayed where it was. The table but the table slid by. So you'd stand that thing up, and you had this handle that you hung onto, and if you pull down on that handle, the table would go, and of course the block would go. So you'd get it lined up. It was set up to cut off 4 inches, stood up, mind you, so going like this. And when you pull that handle, of course, the first slab you had to cut just to get the slab off. The outside slab, there was nothing there, but you'd make sure you got into it enough, and that piece of wood would go into another conveyor that would go up and out into the wood chute. So then you bring it back. This is all electric hydraulic. It would come, you let off the handle and it would come back on its own. Then you shove that in against the fence and go again, and it would take 4 inches out of it. And that would go over through, and there was a guy on the other end piling those slabs to go to the bench saw. Okay, so you'd saw that. If it was a 12-inch block, you might get 2 passes through it. A 16-inch block, you might get 3. You never got, you know, you had to slab it off both sides. So sometimes you'd get 2, 3 bobbin squares out of a slab, but most of the time 1 or 2. But that's how those would get sawed up, and they'd go through the saw and they'd end up over there, and the guy would pile them up for the bench saw where, I'm going to have to think of his name too, but Johnny Peterson. Johnny liked to run that saw, but he lost a lot of fingers running that saw. But anyway, Frank Smith was running the Ricker saw. So I was piling blocks, which, man, I'm telling you, they had an electric hoist in there, but when you get a block like that, a rock maple, there's no, I mean, you might be able to pick one up if you're ignorant, but the damn electric hoist head was so slow that the guys downstairs, they just loved those big logs because they'd bury you with them. They'd saw them up and they'd come up and bomb down on the ground, or there'd be 4 or 5 of them laying there, and you're going as fast as you can. They didn't care. So, but anyway, it was my job to get that stuff piled out of the way. So Frank I'd either help him put them on the Ricker saw, or else he'd do it himself. And he was not in any great big hurry, because he always had blocks ahead, these slabs ahead of the bench saw, which Johnny Peterson was running. So I piled the blocks down below. I took away from the bolting saw and rolled them onto that, up to, and they dropped down in, and then I had to roll them over and pile them, stack them out of the way, so that Frank could saw them. Well, since I was right there and my dad didn't care whether I lost fingers or not, he'd put me on that saw when Frank would go out to take a smoke break or something. He'd say, "You run it." Okay, how old was I? 19. Shit, I knew everything. So I could do that. So yeah, I could do it, no problem. But I didn't run it all the time, just when I spelled, if Frank was gone for a day or something, if he was out sick or something, I'd run it. But that was kind of an interesting saw, and it wasn't particularly dangerous, which was better than some of the stuff. I never got hurt or had any real problems with that. But then old Johnny Peterson one day sawed off a couple fingers. Matter of fact, I think he sawed off one he'd already sawed off. Just trimmed it back a little. He was a great hand to not pay attention. Nicest guy, but he shouldn't have been running that saw. He just shouldn't have been, because it seemed like every year he'd get hurt, cut something off. Well, anyway, one day my dad, Johnny cut a couple fingers off, and they were laying right there on the goddamn bench saw. And Dad come down, scooped the fingers up, and rushed Johnny off down to the doctor to see if they could sew him back on. And he points at me and he says, puts me on that saw. So I wiped the blood off the bench there with some sawdust and went for it. That was just like a big bench saw, probably 20-inch bench saw, something like that. Oh, but whirl, that goddamn thing would scare you. There's no guard or nothing, just a blade there. And it was, so the slabs that they gave you were 4 inches thick. So you laid them down and you ran it through the first time to clean it up, that edge, put that in the chute that went up out to the wood bin. Then you'd slide it over and you wax that thing up so that thing would just float around there. Even though it weighed 30, 40 pounds, it would just float. And you could literally throw it through that goddamn saw if you got good at it, if it was really sharp. And what you're doing, you're making a 4x4 by 16-inch, let's say, square, so that you could turn that out of it. So, the only time, I never got hurt there, but boy, I come close. Those saw blades were set up just like a big saw blade. In other words, they had, the teeth could be replaced, so you crank the teeth into the saw. And one day I was running that thing, and I can't remember if I hit something. Once in a while you hit an old spout, because these were maple trees that they cut, you know. Sometimes if you hit an old cast iron spout, all hell would break loose. Well, I don't know what I hit, or if I did hit anything, but one of them teeth came loose. And I had on, we used to wear old Brothers, 4 or 5 Brothers or something was the name of the brand. Green pants, green shirt, mill wear. Well, I had my shirt out, hanging down, and that goddamn tooth flew out of that saw, come out through, went through my shirt, my loose shirt, bounced off the belt that I had, and went out through the back of my shirt just like a bullet. Never found it. And if it had been that much further in, it would have taken my hip right off. But I never got a scratch out of it, but it tore some holes in my shirt. And I'm telling you, I had a lot more respect for that saw after that. And Dad was the one that always put the teeth in. Did all the sharpening. He was a foreman. He'd sit up there and sharpen blades and do stuff all day long. Come down and holler at somebody. So that was the bench saw. And I got to run that quite a lot. But you could get good at that, because that thing, I'm telling you, if it was really sharp and you wax that up, that thing would just float. And you could, if you got good blocks, big blocks like that, man, you could put out a lot of bobbins. So from there, they went, I'm not sure what the hell the deal was, if it was a bin or something, but I wasn't very far away from they made an automatic boring machine and lathe combo. They built it right there in the machine shop across the road. I'll think of his name too. But he's the one that, they came up with a design and they built that great big machine and put it out there and it worked good. But you take the blocks, and they had a thing that would feed it into the lathe. It's set like that, so you'd set the blocks down in on a corner like that so that they wouldn't flop around. They'd set right down in there and they'd keep going, keep going, keep going. And they'd get to a certain spot and 2 bits would come in and they'd go and that would bore the hole through the bobbin. You needed to have a hole through the bobbin so it would dry properly. And also, that's what, when it went up on the lathe, that's what the holes, they stuck those burrs into those holes to center the bobbin on the lathe. And then after that boring machine, then it would go like one more hop, and then it would go into the lathe, and it would just bring it into that lathe, and it would automatically the knife would come in, about that long. I mean, it didn't take, and like I say, they were just roughing them. So figure a 4-inch square block, and that's what you ended up with when you got done. You can see the marks on there where it grabbed it. You see that? You can see those teeth marks on the end. This end was cut. Oh, I know. After it went through the bench saw, it went to a station where it was a double end trimming station, really. Bulldog Hoyt used to do that. How he'd chew his tongue. And from there they'd go on to the automatic lathe. So the Ricker saw, bench saw, double end trimmer onto the lathe. And the lathe would Frank, God almighty, I'm having a hard time with names. I'll come up with it. But anyway, his name was Frank. And anyway, all he had to do was maintain and watch over that machine, because that thing had a million spinning parts on it, and he just watched it. He'd set those blocks on there. That was his job. Watch a machine, set the blocks on. And once they got done being turned, they'd go through and land in a great big bobbin box. And that box would somebody would come and get it, and they'd take it out to the other end of the shop where there was a dipping, where you dip each end in wax, and then it would go in these boxes, go up to the end into an elevator way up to the 3rd floor, up in where they dried stuff up there. So from there, they had to dry for a long time before they were able to turn them again. But then they went up into the finishing area upstairs. Now, I don't even know if I ever even went up there. There's another whole crew that worked up there. But that's the story of what I did there. I mean, we did some small bobbins. There was a splitter. They used to just split the small bobbins, and then Milton Partington and I sawed some one time. That didn't work out as well, because the sawed bobbins, you got a lot more, but there's a lot of waste because they were sawn instead of split. And the split would follow the natural course of the wood, whereas the saw would saw that grain right off, and it would just weaken that, and it wouldn't make as good a bobbin. But we made thousands of them anyway. So that's one other episode I had. I was at that waxing machine where you just dip both ends of them. So you take one, there'd be 2 boxes, one full of just fresh turned bobbins, and another one that was empty. So you'd sit there and you go doink, doink, clunk. I mean, you do that all day long. Well, I was sitting there doing that, and I could feel this vibration and hear a vibration. And I looked up at the back of that automatic lathe, and there was a big, thick, round cast iron wheel, about that big round. It was a balance wheel, and once it got the machine, it kept the machine going, in other words. And that thing was going right back and forth on that shaft up there. It had loosened up, and it was going back and forth like that. And I took one look at that, and I headed for timber somewhere. I got the hell out of there. And shortly after that, that ran out there enough on the end of that shaft, so it bent that shaft and that wheel, came right out through there and slammed it into that box where I was standing, and it was just spinning like that. Banging and trying to go. Not safe. And that laid that thing up for a while, because they had to get a new shaft in there, and that really screwed that thing up. That shut down procedures for a while. But I guess, other than getting my hand burned on a steam pipe out there when I was trying to, old Chappie was out splitting bobbins, and he got a bunch of them in there, and he needed to have me get up in there and knock them over for him. And I went up in there and reached up and grabbed it on one of them raw steam pipes and burned the shit out of my hand. So I knew better the next time. But that was a pretty big outfit. I mean, there's the sign, one of the signs. This Bowen, Hunter, and Lee. Now that was probably in the 20s. Lee was a engineer from Bradford. This Bowen was, I don't remember. I know he was one of the main guys in this. Hunter, Harry Hunter, I think he was also an engineer. He came up and worked around in the mines or something and got hooked up with this Bowen guy, and they built that mill up. Now, I know my dad worked there in the late 30s before he went in the service, and I think it was going, at some level, was going quite a lot before that. Bobbins were a big business in this area. So that was the head guy, and this is Ernest Bowen. I got this sign a couple of years ago from Ernie French. Now, Ernie French's mother was a Bowen, and the sister to Ernest Bowen, and I don't know how she ended up getting this, but this hung in his office anyway. I saw it down there, Ernie, they were having a lawn sale there, he was getting ready to move, and I saw that and I said, God, Ernie, can I buy that from you? Oh, hell yeah. So I've got it now. Okay, now, the guy that was running the automatic boring machine was Frank, I just had it, Ordway, Frank Ordway. Good guy, I worked with him quite a lot, good guy. All right, now, this is a picture, and I'll have to stand up to show this to you because I want you to see my dad. He's in there. There's a lot of people in there I could name off, but I won't. God, I see Chet Macklin and Lawrence Amir in there. Gosh, a lot of guys. But anyway, that gives you an idea how many men there were working.
We're going to have to get a good shot here so that it's no glare. Oh, that's not bad. Okay.
Okay, you can see how many men. I mean, there's 4 or 5 rows of them there. There's a lot of guys there, 50, 60 guys, more.
Boy, how about we lay it down on that table right there and see if I can... There we go.
Okay.
You want to point to faces? And
Okay, that's my dad. Now remember, this is when he was probably 18, 19 years old. That's before he went in the service, I believe. I don't think it was after, I think it was before. But there's a lot of guys in there, I know, and you wouldn't know hardly any of them, but that's Lawrence Amira right there. What else do I know? Chet Macklin. Wow. There's Johnny Peterson, the one that was running the bench saw that liked to cut his fingers off. You get up in here. Oh, I don't know. If I look closer, I'd see. This must be the Bowen and Hunter. There's the office help. I know that guy, but I can't think of his name. Oh, God, Les Welch. I don't know. Hell, I mean, this is a long time ago here.
yeah, I'm pretty impressed.
Some of these guys have been dead for 60 years. That's, oh God, I think that's a Welch. That's my dad. I know that guy. Oh, I know who that is. That's Hodge. Could be Rob Hodge. I don't know. I guess that's enough.
That's good.
That's pretty damn good for an old fart to remember that. I remember I worked there in 1967, so that's a while ago.